Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I am Nick Kanoki, Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am excited for a program featuring Jack Kelly, as well as a special guest, Jack Dempsey, and we'll introduce those two in a moment. But before we get underway, we just want to thank our ALN Platinum organizational member, Onuma System, as well as our patron members, and all our organizational members for helping make this program and our newsletter and other programs possible. So thank you for your continued support. And if you're interested in working with us, reach out and we can figure out how we can work together. And a few upcoming events. August 16th, we have the Value and Benefits from Asset Management series continues. With some transportation industry, I think rail specific discussion. And then we also, on the next day, have Thursday at 3 on August 17th with John Arnott and Kimon Onuma, a bit of a continuation of an AI supported brainstorm approach to different industries. And this one is focused on ports. So stay tuned for those upcoming events. And with that, I will bring Mike Bordenero, Executive Director, in and just say that if you're out there watching, we'd love to hear from you. So please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat, or you can use the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar to submit a question. Mike, welcome.
So thanks for laying out some of the programs coming up. What we don't have listed there is the UN we have a special back-to-back program with the United Nations talking about their approach to asset management for entire countries. They're one of the few other organizations who, like us, have the National Asset Leadership Strategy, and other countries have this, but we're looking forward to talking with them about that. So Nick, what is the fire report in Wyoming these days? Are you guys getting any fires or smoke from fires? Or
no, seems pretty clear. The weather's been strange. It's been hot. The fire danger grows higher, but no big fires that I know of nearby. And I have heard the rural fire sirens occasionally, so probably some brush fires going on, but nothing major and no smoke from Canada or anybody else. So we're doing great.
Yeah, I'm here in Chicago, and today's a good day, but we've had some bad smoke. So anyway, thanks for setting us up and having that extensive introduction on Jack Kelly, who is an ALN Board of Directors member and an ALN Senior Fellow. He's been a dynamo for us. And Jack, if you Kelly, if you'll join us. I have known about Jack Kelly's involvement in the City Pair travel program, and that the U.S. Government Accountability Office had done a study after it first got started in the early 80s. And the study indicated that $1 billion was being saved. $2 billion a year is now. But the first GAO report, I think, said the first one was 2. And then I'm putting up a link right now. I saw a GSA newsletter report. Press release, thank you. Talking about 2024, and it's going to be saving $2.4 billion. And I was like, this is a spectacular example of a person taking charge of an initiative and measurably saving the U.S. federal government money. And we need to highlight the fact that this person who led this team is connected to us, but also to kind of pick his brain to see how that type of thinking that got a big initiative going on travel policy might be able to apply to asset management. And then Nick said that Jack Dempsey, another ALN board member, an ALN senior fellow, and a member of the ALN, is going to talk about how that might be happening related to the National Academy's strategies report on federal facilities. So we got a lot to pack in. I promised you we're going to go into overtime today. I almost guarantee it. And so Jack, congratulations on having a legacy of billions of dollars being saved because of initiative you led. And I know that you say other people were involved, but can you tell us about how you pushed all these people through?
No, what I'd like to describe is, I mean, the way you framed your original request for me to chat about this was to what were the kind of the lessons learned that I took away from this initiative that would be applicable to advancing asset management. And so
Yes.
I thought what would be helpful first is to explain the background that I brought to the federal government before this project was established. And then talk about the lessons that some of the lessons that I'd learned earlier were reinforced by the project, and in other cases I learned new lessons, and how those lessons kind of were, I guess the right way to describe it is how those lessons characterized my 42-year career in public service. I mean, my entire career in public service, 6 years at the state government of Georgia and 36 years at the at OMB, were all about management reform. I started at the state of Georgia on the Georgia reorganization project under Governor Jimmy Carter. And then after he left, after the reorganization was implemented, and it was successfully implemented, I stayed on and was kind of an internal management consultant, helping address various kinds of management problems, some big, some small, and a whole variety of subject matter. And so, and I stayed, and after Governor Carter left, I stayed on under his successor and did more of the same. And sometimes the projects were, again, more complex, sometimes less complex. But I had developed, I guess, a sufficiently good reputation in Georgia that I was invited by the Carter OMB to come up and join what they call the project management staff for the president's reorganization project. And I was the only person on that staff that actually had done the work. All the other four were all basically campaign workers, and so it fell mostly on me to create the strategy for that reorganization project. And I brought in people to help, in areas that I wasn't strong in, and I thought we came up with a really good strategy. One of the things that frustrated me back when Jeff Zients was the deputy for management in OMB and created his own little reorganization effort was in the write-up on their reorganization effort, they didn't mention the Carter reorganization effort. And yet the Carter reorganization effort actually resulted in more real changes, many of which have lasted till today, like the Department of Energy, Department of Education, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Office of Personnel Management, the Senior Executive Service, the Executive Office of the President. I mean, and there are more. So there were a bunch of things that really were profound reorganization changes under Carter that people have totally forgotten about. So after the reorganization ended, I had an opportunity to take on one of the responsibilities that the assistant director for management, who was in charge of all the management policy activities in OMB, I had an opportunity to pick off one of the assignments that his chief of staff had on her plate as she was moving on to the director's office. And so the one that looked the most interesting to me was somebody at GSA had proposed taking, leveraging the government's buying power to get discount airfares, which I thought, well, that sounds pretty interesting. Let me take it on. So long story short, I did my usual consultant's due diligence. I looked into, so how are travel policies set? How do people arrange travel? What do the airlines think about all this? I mean, so I kind of covered the ground of everything related to travel, and I decided, well, what the real opportunity here is not just, it's not just an opportunity, it's a requirement. You can't go after discount airfares unless you have the mechanisms in place to shift market share. And that gets involved in making travel arrangements and authorizing travel, and to change that, you have to change the regulations. And so there are different agencies in charge of the travel regulations. And so basically I did all this stuff, and I put together a project plan, presented it to the assistant director for management, and he gave me permission to proceed. So I did the way I usually do these things is I reached out to the agencies to get their people who are smart in this area, people who are way more knowledgeable than me. And we put together a team of about 11 folks, and we spent 10 months gathering information and working through recommendations. And we came out with our report literally in July of 1981. So that was after the Carter administration was over, and the Reagan administration had come in, and they were looking for, something that they could do quickly to show early success. And so the recommendations that we had made attracted their attention, and I was given authorization to set up the implementation phase of this project. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that GAO, which is like they have the greatest repository of knowledge about how federal agencies actually work in all manner of ways. And so they were part of the study phase of this project. It wasn't appropriate for them to be part of the implementation phase because they might eventually have to audit themselves, and that's not a place you want to be. So anyhow, so we did the implementation, and it was successful. We did a whole lot of the things, including the City Pair program is one of the things that came out of that implementation. Changing the per diem system was another. So there were a whole host of travel reforms, most of which are in place today and have been improved over time. Anyhow, so what did I learn in all that? Well, first thing I learned was that of my experiences up until that point in time, government reorganizations were far and away the most complicated management reform efforts. And I mean, they're really tricky for a whole lot of reasons. This travel project was the next most complex. And there were a lot of, as I think back on it, there were a lot of significant lessons that I carried with me. The first is the importance of identifying key stakeholders and how those stakeholders can be most productively engaged in the reform process, starting with identifying the problems, what the desired project outcomes are, measured and expressed in measurable ways, and the best ways of achieving those outcomes. And I cannot overstate the importance of doing this well, identifying the right people. And so for this project, the stakeholders were organizations or people who had the authority to make the changes needed to achieve the desired outcomes. This includes solving the problems identified with the current approaches. And in the case of the travel project, there were 3 agencies with authority to issue travel regulations, as well as the agency travel policy offices that communicated those regulations to their employees and oversaw how well or poorly those regulations were being implemented. They monitored the impact of those actions that were taken on their agencies, and then they communicated problems back up the chain of command. So in other words, if we had set a policy in place that was having a negative effect on the agencies, that information could be translated back up and we could do something about it. So it's kind of closing the information loop. Then another set of stakeholders were the organizations and people who were directly impacted by the outcomes. And that's mainly customers and beneficiaries. In the case of the travel project, it was the travelers themselves. It was their agencies who were traveling to get certain things done, as well as the travel service providers. And these were travel agents, airlines, rental car companies, hotels, and so forth. The next group of stakeholders were the organizations and people who controlled the processes and behaviors that directly affect the outcomes we're trying to impact. So in case of the City Pair program, again, that includes the travelers, but it also includes the people or organizations that make airline reservations, in this case, travel agents. And prior to our project, the government was not permitted to use travel agents. One of the results of our project was we were. So there were, when you get down to this level, now we're down really near the operational level or at the operational level. And there are 2 keys to the success of the program. The first key was giving travelers sufficient information to get from their starting points to their destinations within the constraints of the City Pair program. And I've told people this before, is at the beginning of the City Pair program, basically GSA went out and solicited, airline responses to the City Pair proposals. They got 4 airlines responded with bids on 11 routes. And the routes some of the routes were just terrible. So for example, the DC to San Francisco city pair, the route went from BWI, Baltimore Washington International Airport, to Oakland International Airport. It didn't go from DCA down, which is, Ronald Reagan Airport, to the San Francisco airport. It went to two almost like satellite airports. And so when I saw that, I thought, they're trying to offer rates that no one's going to use because it's not going to help them get their jobs done. So I came up with the idea that what we need to do is create a travel directory that explains how federal travelers who need to get from Washington to San Francisco can do it by getting to BWI, to and from BWI place of work, and to and from downtown or wherever in San Francisco area they need to get to. And I tried to get other agencies to actually write this directory up, and nobody would. So I literally had my secretary type it. And so it was the first version of the federal travel directory. And later on, other people picked it up, and then it became a commercial thing. So but that was the key. That was one of the keys, is you got to help people. Feds are good about obeying regulations if they understand them and they can do them. The second part was we had to make sure that the airline reservation process directed travelers to the available city pairs, because that was the key to shifting market share. If you didn't shift market share, you weren't going to get any discounts. And we did that by making sure travelers were required by the federal travel regulations to use the contract travel agents. And then we made sure that the travel agent contracts had in it the requirement that the travel agents had to guide them first to the city pair program. And then there was a whole justification process. So there's a lot of details that had to be worked out at the operational level to make this work. And we did it. So to summarize, stakeholders create the conditions within which organizations operate. And the asset management term for that is the context of the organization, which may come up later. So now going back to the high level lessons for successful projects, you need to have a project plan that involves the stakeholders in the tasks that are most important to them and that monitors their involvement in the task. You have to have tools needed to communicate the desired outcomes and ways of achieving them to the people responsible for achieving the outcomes and to the authorities that create those tools. You have to have great communications across all the different players. And then you have to oversee the management of the project to assure that the project tasks are being conducted appropriately and they're achieving the desired results. So that at a very high level, that's the view of the lessons I had learned about how to conduct successful management reform efforts by the time I retired from federal service in 2013. A year and a half after I retired, I had the opportunity to meet Jim Dieter and Jack Dempsey. GSA invited me to come over. People from GSA's Office of Government-Wide Policy invited me to come over to listen to a proposal by Jim and Jack about an executive order that they had written that would have required federal agencies to adopt asset management. And I listened, and they talked about this ISO 55000. I'd never heard of it. Of course, ISO 55000 came out in 2014. That was the year after I retired. So I was able to get a hold of a copy of the standard. And when I read it, I thought, oh my goodness, this is such great stuff. These principles are so, common sense and well thought out, and they cover a whole lot. They cover probably more than I had learned over my 42 years of work. So I was thrilled to learn about them. In fact, and then I thought, well, I think I'll join the ALN because I think this is something that is really powerful. And I want to be part of making it happen in the US. Now, in my first meeting with Jim and Jack, I told them, I listened to their pitch about an executive order, and I told them that I thought an executive order might be a good starting point, but it's not the end point. I mean, you can't, having been part of writing a lot of OMB policies and helping write executive orders, I knew that, if you don't do more than just issue the policy, the likelihood of that policy being implemented is small. And so that's, in fact, the reason I did the travel project was because I thought I'd naively, at the end of my time on reorganization, I thought that the reason that OMB wasn't more involved in implementing its policies was it just didn't know how. So I thought I'd create the travel project as a demonstration project of how you can actually get things done. And OMB didn't care. So I was concerned that Jack and Jim had the, thought that an executive order was going to be all you needed to do. And I wanted to disabuse them of that idea. Now, so at this point, when I go back to your original request to talk about how do we advance asset management based on the lessons learned, the point I'd like to make is asset management had more principles, reform principles baked into it than I had learned. So I didn't have anything, and I don't have anything to offer based on my lessons, the lessons that I have learned that would, improve the quality of the asset management guidance that's already out there. However, the more fundamental question is, how can we advance the progress of asset management in different countries? And so I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the US. And by the way, it just so happens that Jack and Jim started a new international standard called ISO 55011, as I understand it, soon after the ISO 55000 came out. And the purpose of that was to figure out how to use public policy to advance the cause of asset management in different countries. And so that's what 55011 does. And it's in the final stages of the international approval process right now. And basically what 55000 says is, or address the issue it addresses is, how can individuals and organizations that advocate asset management most effectively engage the political processes in their respective countries so that they create public policies that support and advance asset management. So it's all about connecting the interested parties to the political processes. That's the key. So for those, I'm assuming that people on the call have different levels of understanding about the state of asset management in the US. First of all, from a public policy perspective, there are two different ways that public policies are developed. First, by legislative authorities, like laws passed by Congress, and then two, by executive authorities. And that would be, OMB circulars and White House memorandum and executive orders, things that come from the White House and OMB. So Congress has already taken, and I learned this kind of late. It took me a while to figure this out. I mean, Congress had already taken some steps to introduce asset management requirements for state and local recipients of federal grants and loans in the transportation and water sectors. Now, it would be nice if we could get Congress to expand those requirements to other sectors and also kind of, flesh them out a little bit more. On the executive side, White House and OMB have taken limited steps to implement basic asset management requirements, like requiring agencies to develop real property asset management plans, and a whole bunch of other things related to space management. But what's missing is a lack of understanding of how asset management supports mission. And that's kind of the missing link. It's all about, spending less money, but it totally ignores the implications on mission. And that's fundamental to asset management. So there's a lot more to be done in both of these areas. Now, within the federal government, there are several agencies that have already begun to implement asset management requirements on their own. To my knowledge, the Western Area Power Administration has adopted ISO 55000 requirements for almost all of its asset categories. The Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program, NASA, Air Force, and probably some other agencies have adopted asset management requirements for selected aspects of their asset management programs, but not comprehensively, again, to the best of my knowledge. And we also know that there are several U.S. companies that have implemented asset management, and we believe that there are a lot more out there than we know about. Now, the federal agency that's developed the deepest understanding of and appreciation for asset management is the General Accountability Office, or GAO. That's the audit and policy compliance arm of Congress. They don't set management policies, but they review how effectively agencies implement existing policies. And they've become a more effective advocate for asset management across the US government than either Congress as a whole or the Executive Office of the President. In November 2018, GAO issued a report number GAO 1957 on real property asset management. It was a report based on an extensive review of asset management literature, including the ISO 55000 series of standards and other best practices from around the world. They identified 6 key characteristics of an asset management framework, and they assessed whether government-wide asset management guidance and information reflected those key characteristics. And they did this based on a detailed review of 6 agencies' real property asset management practices. Now, we understand that GAO has since incorporated this type of assessment, that is, how well this framework has been adopted, in subsequent reviews of agency programs that involve both real and personal property assets. So GAO is my hero on this. So 55011 identifies several types of non-government organizations that can influence public policies. In the US, those are asset management advocacy groups such as the Asset Leadership Network, the Institute for Asset Management North America, and the US Technical Advisory Group, the TC 251. That's the US group that basically participates in the international standard setting process. Next type of group are professional associations that advocate and or support asset management awareness among their members. Those include the American Society for Civil Engineers, which looks at all infrastructure sectors, the American Waterworks Association, which basically looks at water infrastructure, the American Society for State Highway Transportation Officers, AASHTO, which deals with transportation infrastructure, and there are a bunch of others. The Federal Facilities Council under the National Academy might be considered part of this group. It's either this group and the next group. And the next group are other government, what we call good government advocacy groups, like the Partnership for Public Service, National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA, and others. And they may or may not decide that they want to embrace asset management once they understand what it is and the benefits that it can bring to the government. So what do we need to do in the US to advance our situation further? I believe that the most important step for improving asset management in this country, and probably any other country through public policy, is creating a set of expectations for good asset management and holding the key government stakeholders accountable for achieving those expectations. The shorthand word for that is scorecards. Now, the best current example of this scorecard approach, again, we go back to GAO, and it's a GAO high risk list, which has identified real property management as a high risk in the federal government. And every 2 years, they issue a report on the extent to which government agencies have taken steps to reduce that risk. So that keeps the issue of asset management of real property in the spotlight within the federal government. And that I think has resulted in some progress, and I'm sure it will result in more. Now, because GAO assesses how well agencies have adopted these 6 characteristics of an asset management framework, when it reviews agency programs where asset management is a key element, there may be an opportunity for them to create a scorecard based on those assessments. It might not get the same visibility as a high risk list, but it's a way to kind of keep these recommendations out there and shine a light on this is what experts have said you should be doing. What are you doing? And that, I think, is really, really important. So in the case of the American Society of Civil Engineers, they have a biannual infrastructure report card, which is a great first step for creating baseline scores for the conditions of any infrastructure asset categories. However, again, there may be something there more than what I know, but what I'm missing and what I know about them is what are they doing? What have they done to identify specific recommendations to agencies to improve the situation, to prove those infrastructure scores? I think some next step like that is really critical to put pressure on the people who can make a difference in the infrastructure condition to take the necessary steps to do that. So basically, and now I'm going to talk about the Federal Facilities Council, and this we might get Jack Dempsey to jump in here. The Federal Facilities Council report that just came out fairly recently on strategies to renew federal facilities, they make some excellent recommendations. But what I haven't seen yet, and what I think an opportunity for the Federal Facilities Council is out there, is to highlight those, so go back and maybe every 6 months, every 12 months, and revisit the status of the implementation of those recommendations and publicize that. And so if they were to do that, and this is true of any other organization like them that makes recommendations about how to make things better, if you go back and you follow up and say, oh, so this recommendation's been out there for the last year, what's happening? And kind of put those agencies, I hate to put it in this term, but it's kind of on the defensive. People that just sit on their thumbs and don't address these really high quality recommendations, they should be called out for that, because a lot of good work went into those recommendations, and for, as best I can tell, those are really sound ideas. So I believe that holding government entities accountable for their performance in achieving outcomes is the key to encouraging asset management. Now, OMB would probably like to claim that it already does this through the President's Management Agenda and the performance.gov website. I respectfully disagree. The President's Management Agenda is limited to a few activities that are of particular interest to the administration and power. It doesn't include outcomes that might be important to Congress, to the agencies, or to the public. We don't have, in this country, we don't have any way to currently know what those outcomes are. For example, we don't have a set of national objectives for various types of infrastructure. Also, the results reported on the performance.gov website aren't independently audited. And frankly, I wouldn't consider them credible. So with that little last bit of good news, I think I'm ready to shut up, take questions, and get Jack Dempsey to jump in.
Well, literally, if I was there, I would give you a pat on the back. We're going to transcribe that, and you're going to have a white paper based on what you just presented. There was a very unique approach to ALN Thursday at 3, where I asked you a question, you said you weren't going to answer it, and then you just addressed all the things that have been burning in you, and that's exactly what we wanted to have. So there are questions, but Jack Dempsey, you were referenced, and so was the report that you and Mike Imany played key roles in. So why don't you give some feedback here, and we'll get to questions eventually.
Yeah, I won't be as long as. By the way, thank you, Jack. I mean,
Yes.
the work and tenacity and the ever kind of going attitude of trying to figure things out. I mean, policy is challenging to most of us. Understanding how important policy is and how influential it can be is, at least for my experience as a mid-level officer, was kind of an enlightening moment. And then it still took years to understand how to evolve or actually apply policy or evolve policies in ways that can be really effective. And I think your career certainly speaks to that skill set and how important that can be. So,
Jack Dempsey, yeah, can I just also include that the reason why Jack Kelly was able to do this huge work with travel, he established the Office of Government Policy in the GSA, and it was from that office that he used as a springboard. So it's even deeper than he revealed. So anyway, so go ahead, Jack Dempsey.
The web is complex and goes in all directions. I'll just highlight a couple points, and then I think there's a lot of chat in the chat side, and I'm sure lots of experts here on the call that want to get involved and share their thoughts as well. But kind of consistent with what Jack Kelly was saying, when we did the strategies to renew federal facilities, first of all, I want to make a call out to GAO 1957, and Emil Sachoy is on the call here, who led that effort. And I think she has probably some great insights to say. When we started the National Academies report, it was extremely helpful to have that GAO report to have framed and kind of like really evaluate the landscape. It made it, I would say, easier for the committee to understand the importance and significance of asset management and a policy statement. Our charge asked us to develop a how-to guide or how-to information about simply how to make a better business case for agencies to get more money. Looking at GAO helped us understand that this is a time-honored problem, and we went back in our research, looked over the last 30 years. basically the problem was known. Effort after effort was attempted to try to solve the problem, yet basically the problem still remained. And the evidence of that was significant and growing deferred maintenance backlogs. Every agency can lament about that, which translates as being underfunded for the facility requirements. And then also recognition of a substantial amount of excess property or underutilized property, which I think is only going to get worse now with the post-COVID issues with our work environment and work strategies and just how we kind of work today in our relationship to the office environment. So there's that's only going to continue. When we approached that, we figured out, okay, we got to look at this a little bit differently. That led us into the asset management perspective. And there's a report that the ISO committee put out, managing assets in the context of asset management, that also started help providing context to look at things different. Jack Kelly made the point many times over about the context. I like Cecil's comment on ISO 55000 4.1 and 4.2 as like a chicken and an egg. I would agree with that. I've often tried to say, okay, 4.1 is about the context, 4.2 is about stakeholders, but they're really an interactive bunch. You can't really look at one independent of the other. You have to kind of understand both of those. I think that's important. The outcome of strategies became, and there's a statement in there that says this is not a strategy, it's a policy. And the intention behind that was to understand that basically, organizational change was required. I think GAO 1957 makes good points about the culture behind this and how you have to approach doing things. So I think, Jack, your points and examples that you've raised about, sticking with it, understanding how policy is an instrument for good, recognizing that asset management and things we're doing is really about outcome orientation. It has to relate to the stakeholders are very important. And we're hopeful that the strategies to renew federal facilities and its 5 recommendations are supportive of that. And although it's a slower conversation when we talk about change management at an enterprise level or policy, I would submit there's been a lot of very positive feedback at senior levels across Department of Defense and throughout a number of civilian agencies that have read the report, are continuing to read and evaluate the report, and then trying to attempt to apply that. And then I think that story is also echoed on internationally. In fact, it was just this week, I've talked to 3 different professionals who are leading asset management activities of 3 different countries, South Africa, Morocco, and the UK, who are challenged with exactly the same problem. So there's a lot of people, and I think a growing kind of chorus that is understanding this problem and trying to and advocate for changes there. I'll leave it at that. I mean, there's lots more to talk about, but I know a number of the people participating here, I think, have some questions that they want to get out there and enter into the conversation.
So yes, I'll line those up, but Jack Kelly, do you want to respond to Jack Dempsey? Your microphone is off.
That would be a problem. No, I think Jack makes excellent comments as always. And, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, he's one of the ALN's great assets.
We agree on that also. So Amelia had a question about EO 13327 from 2004. It has made a difference of federal agencies' asset management practices. How do you think that made any difference when it's not enforced? And if you could tell us what that executive order is, we're not all familiar with the numbers.
Well, basically, that executive order, well, that's a story I don't need to tell. So that executive order came out of some legislation that never made it. And so the executive order was Plan B for a much broader legislative proposal. And the Plan B was what we can do administratively. So that's why OMB proceeded with that. I was I think, moved already over to OFPP by the time it came out. So I wasn't directly involved. I was consulted in the early versions of it, but not
Has it been
closely thereafter.
effective? Do you know?
That Jack Dempsey is the guy who can answer that question.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll make a couple quick points. It has been. I mean, when you go back to almost everybody's, not everybody, but many federal agencies, their policy, they cite that executive order 13.327, as kind of like the initiating authority. You go to the GSA Office of Government-Wide Policy on Asset Management, and they've built like a whole enterprise around that executive order. It is still alive and moving forward. It was codified, or large parts of that executive order are codified in law in the Federal Property Reform Act of 2016. So it's not just an executive order anymore. It's actually the law of the land, and that is now matriculating down into practice. It takes a while for this to happen. So that's kind of continuing the torch. I really look at, in today's terms, that Federal Property Reform Act of 2016 as a torch bearer of really the leading laws now in what we're doing. But 13.327 was really the vanguard in making a lot of things happen. I mean, freeze the footprint, reduce the footprint, all were spun off of that initiative. So those types of products or policies that come out really do have ripple effects that can be now observed over across decades.
One thing I regret about that executive order is that it continues a bifurcated understanding of assets within the federal government and separates out real property assets and attention to them from personal property assets. And so, one of the great ironies is, to me, is that because you've got a Federal Real Property Council, you've got this executive order, you've got high level attention to real property assets, but within the federal government, the personal property community is the community that has done the most to advance asset management in the comprehensive way that we think about it. And leaders from that community, and I'm thinking Jim Dieter, Rich Culbertson, a number of people, Bernie Bartel, a number of people that represent, and folks, Bob Haycock within GSA, within the Office of Government-Wide Policy. I mean, these folks understood it. They operated kind of under the radar. It took me a while to actually learn all the amazing things that they were doing, because I was mostly interested. Personal property is all about property disposal. So, from an OMB perspective, OMB has had a very limited understanding about the significance of assets to agency missions. And the other thing that I've mentioned in other forums is that when you look at ISO 55001 certifications as being compliant with asset management requirements, almost all of them have scopes of work that are built around personal property, not around real property. So
to continue, so thank you for that. And then Amelia is saying the impact of that federal real property executive order is being felt, and it is rippling through. And that's one of the great things about strategies, is that it points out all of the good things that are in place, and then makes the 5 recommendations on what triggers need to happen to have things come together so that we can get the kind of benefits that the city pairs travel program did. Does that sound about right, Jack Dempsey?
And to kind of carry that point forward, I mean, in strategies, it self-declares this is a bold step. It's one of those things that I think is often with asset management is kind of misunderstood. We're already managing assets. What else are we supposed to do?
Right.
Strategies recognizes, and as we've been kind of sharing that with different audiences, the federal policy, OMB policies, are actually very good and pretty comprehensive in terms of the activities that are required for asset management. Now, there's a few gaps in that policy that need to be addressed, particularly in the area of accountability, also on the ability to focus and evaluate the performance of assets, as opposed to evaluating the performance of programs and expenditure of funding. I mean, just as one footnote to that, the CFO Act that we're all very familiar with, agencies can pass a CFO Act, be audited on their efforts to pass, with that, in accordance with that act, and still have no idea of what money they're spending on their assets. So, you can't manage what you don't measure. And one of the recommendations and strategies points that out is policy. And at this point, it's probably more likely legislative change is going to be required to improve the accounting structure to move forward. But that said, and to Amelia's point, it is part of a conversation. It really is kind of a chorus of activity. The recommendations were put out with the idea that some can be implemented quickly or provide insights for agencies to improve their asset management capabilities. It truly does target Congress, but more specifically OMB, that there is a leadership responsibility to affect changes in policy. And obviously that is a legislative responsibility. But to break it down in terms of opportunities to make stepwise improvements, I think there's two big elements of strategies that provide that type of support structure. One is there's a discussion on an asset management framework, which is consistent with the updates to ISO 55000, 5001 particularly, that's making a big push on the qualification and definition of a framework that supports an asset management system. So we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming update of that standard. And there's precursors to that in strategies that define a framework. In fact, the policy of an agency needs to speak to this framework, and the framework has behaviors and features that need to be recognized, and 55001 is pretty clear on what some of those behaviors are. But so there's that framework and strategies. There's also, and I think probably the biggest area of response and support have been in 11 principles for asset management system implementation. So strategies does introduce 11 principles of asset management system implementation. They're not asset management principles per se, and this is what you need to be doing if you're Department of Energy or the Forest Service or whoever you might be on your asset management principles. These principles are written specifically, and it's a little bit of a kind of like a layup shot for an organization such as GAO to ask their three questions, and maybe Amelia can give us a little bit more insight, or somebody else can talk about how GAO audits actually work and influence behavior. But those principles speak to, if you implement this framework for asset management, and you have to define that as your own organization, there's principles on data integrity, facility performance, mission alignment, budget cost analysis, operational readiness, maturity. These principles are written such that you would ask yourself, am I doing this? Is my asset management system demonstrating these behaviors? The three auditing questions that I've learned from observation is, one, like for data integrity, the data integrity principle speaks to the data that is used by the asset management system needs to be supportive of the asset management system requirements. So it's kind of a circular argument, but it basically says, if you have a small, unsophisticated capability, then scale your data that supports what you can use it for. Don't go out and get a whole bunch of large data. And as you mature, the idea is your data requirements would improve, but keep it in pace. But you would apply that, and the questions are, is this principle in your policy? Does your policy demonstrate the use of this principle? Is probably maybe a better way of saying that. Question one. Question two is, are you applying this principle through the policy in practice? Can you show me demonstrations of this principle being used? Facility performance is a good one. Facility performance principle says 4 criteria for performance: condition, functionality, availability, and utilization. So if you're an organization managing a facility portfolio, do you have performance metrics that speak to each of those criteria? And if not, you're only working with a couple suits of the deck, not the 4 suits of the deck, so to speak. So you apply it. Is the principle applied to policy? Is the policy used in practice? And the third question is, does it make a difference? I mean, in the end, and Jack's stories really highlight this, it's all about outcomes. So asset management is really trying to achieve improvements in performance. So these principles, in combination with the framework, are intended to help agencies kind of step their way through their own journey, figure out how to improve their asset management competencies, and in that way, improve overall performance, focusing on outcomes, making it scalable, kind of learning as you go. Whereas, so that's kind of the working side of the strategy report. The policy side is just dead on. I mean, there's legislative changes or policies have to change. There are flaws and limitations in current policy. The adage there is, and this is something that the committee talked a lot about on what this report's trying to achieve, is if Congress is giving federal agencies hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to manage their facilities, agencies have a fiduciary responsibility to demonstrate that they're competent in their ability to manage those assets. And strategies recommendations points to failures or limitations in current policy that need to be addressed. So strategies is really kind of talking to two different audiences. One is some key people that are in positions that understand and can start influencing policy, and then more broadly to federal agencies on what does asset management really look like. And it really kind of comes down to the form of what's your framework for asset management, and can do these principles of how that's being implemented, are they actually being actuated? So
in the context of this conversation, why don't you explore one of the policy changes that is recommended?
So one of the policy changes is there's executive order, actually they call them memorandum. So and Jack Kelly, you could probably clarify what's the difference between an executive order and a memorandum.
It's pretty simple.
Go ahead.
The executive order comes from the president. That's the highest form of executive guidance. An OMB policy memorandum supposedly has the equivalent force of law, but in terms of the pecking order of priority, it's nowhere near an executive order.
Right. So there you go. So it's good guidance. So OMB memorandum M20 TAC 03 was basically kind of a continuation of freeze the footprint, reduce the footprint, and some other policies. And it requires that agencies effectively demonstrate that they have an asset management plan. And they call it a real property capital asset management, real property capital plan. The memorandum doesn't actually state that you have to submit that plan, although that's the practice that has to be done. They have to demonstrate that you have this planning process, and the way you do that is evidenced by I have a plan that's doing that. When you go deeper into the policy, there's no actual requirement that plan is like in alignment with the SAMP, the Strategic Asset Management Plan in ISO 55000, which would have you reconcile your mission requirements, what your stakeholders want of you, the budget that you have, and your programs. So that's where there's a lot of risk that happens that isn't accounted for in the budgeting process, or not even really visible to many executives who are running whole programs. So that memorandum, having evidence of a real property capital planning process, more or less, and the way you demonstrate that is to have a plan, doesn't go so far, and neither does the supporting OMB policies, to say that the senior real property officer will sign off and document, what isn't being funded, what risks are not being accounted for in the budget. And so when you string together the policy, you don't have that kind of stamp of approval on the top that provides a responsible and accountable role to ensure that this is where we're at, and this is what's not getting funded, and this is what's not going to get done. No, so right now, that's bad news. Nobody wants to talk about it, and federal policy doesn't require that happens. So we persist in trying to do a good job.
Well, Jack Kelly, what do you think we should do about that?
So I don't know how to, other than what I proposed before, which is to kind of hold up a scorecard to people that says, here's what you've been here's the actions that you've been recommended to take, and here are the ones that you haven't done. Other than some variation of that, I don't know what to do, because frankly, the political process doesn't like to tell bad news. And nobody wants to admit that, neither the president in the president's budget nor Congress in their appropriations acts wants to admit that they are not distributing enough money to meet certain basic public expectations. They just don't want to admit that. I mean, that's like political suicide. So that's a reality that we all have to kind of be aware of. And I'm not a politician, so I don't know how you flip that. I think we could probably look for examples of where politicians have actually done a good job of setting up the conversation with their stakeholders and their constituents to say, hey, look, we've got the simple fact of the matter is that the money that is being made available to us today through the tax income system gets us, it's first of all, it's distributed in the ways that it's distributed, and then the result is that there are what's imbalances in the abilities of different agencies to achieve the missions that they've been given. It would be nice, and I don't know if this would be a kind of project the GAO, maybe if GAO could find a congressional sponsor for a project like this, it would be excellent. But again, going back to politics, I don't know how realistic it is. It's to say, so let's have a look at the levels of funding, and then our best analysis as to the adequacy of those levels of funding to meet certain basic outcomes, and define that in a way that people can really understand it. One of the things that Jack Dempsey is the father of, as best I understand, is something called a mission dependency index, which is one of the absolute most important ways to measure the relationship between funding and mission, facilities. This is a condition of a facility, and this is the impact of that condition on the ability of the agency to accomplish its mission. I mean, to me, that's one of the most powerful concepts, and I don't think it's ever been. The Air Force may do it somewhat, but I don't think it's been. I know that actually an early version of the Federal Real Property Profile included a data field for that. And I think what happened was there was so much controversy within the agencies, they ended up taking it out of the Federal Real Property Profile, which is a real shame, because I was excited to see it in there and disappointed when it was taken out.
I watched that every step of the way, and it got expunged eventually. Which strategies has one of the principles is mission alignment, and it does make a clear statement that you need to have, for agencies to make effective risk-based decisions on facilities or their asset portfolio in alignment with the mission of the organization. They need to have some method that accounts for that. And there's a number of methods. Mission dependency index is one of them, and that's one of the ones that's highlighted in strategies. And there's other metrics out there, and there are different ways of evaluating risks that need to be accounted for. So, but the fact that in the Federal Property Profile there's no requirement that's demonstrated, or requirement in policy that's actually that type of risk is evaluated in the prioritization or management of funding is just a big miss. And these are some of the holes that are existing in policy. And the hope is that strategies will get more of that conversation going, get more of an understanding in the industry about how this, what the opportunities are there. And it is exciting to see, despite superior requirements, laws, or OMB policy, many agencies are actually actively applying ISO 55000 to improve their competencies in asset management, with the exact purpose of improving performance overall. So there's a lot of really good people out there trying to figure out how to do that. And I think, forums like this are just another opportunity to get more of that information out there and have more people figure out a way how they can participate.
Well, that's an excellent way to sum things up, Jack Dempsey. And I want to thank our audience. Well, we got Amelia chiming in here. Maximizing an asset portfolio's value. Yes. So she was just reinforcing that there are agencies out there doing that good work. So Jack Dempsey, thank you for the current work you're doing. I think Jack Kelly even reviewed that. So Jack Kelly, thank you for what you have done and what you continue to do. And the ALN is so happy to provide a platform for forward thinkers like you and like our audience. We have so many people who stuck around for this full hour, and we could have kept talking, but I've got to draw a close to it. So thank you both. And let's share screen here so that we can do proper thanking. I wanted to just have Jack Kelly on our opening slide because this was really based on what he was doing, but thank you, Jack Dempsey, for your contributions. Also, this has been an excellent program. And thank you to our organizational members, Onuma Inc., a platinum organizational member, and our ALN patron members, Jacobs, ABS Quality Evaluations, Definitive Logic, and CGI. And of course, thank you to all of our organizational members, many of who were commenting today. Thank you, John and Cecilia, for your comments. And then in the future, we've got, oh, this was the wrong one. This was the past. We're going backwards. So we've got the UN, we've got a port storm with Trent Port Services coming up, and Jim Dieter is talking about a leadership gap analysis program. We might be talking about that, and we want people to get involved in that. But thank you all for your time today. It was very informative. I really enjoyed it. Have a good rest of your day. Bye for now.